From the very first moment we step into the vast open world of the lands between, we can see the scattered ruins of a mysterious temple in the sky, strewn across the landscape. The nature and origin of these ruins was once one of the earliest tantalizing archaeological details that drew us to the history of the lands between. When we do finally arrive there, Farum Azula is no less a stunning mystery, an entire city suspended in the sky, said to have been built as a mausoleum for the ancient dragon lord, now forever crumbling after a meteor impacted it long ago. Who were its inhabitants? Why did they build this temple? The only current inhabitants, besides the swarms of dragons flying ahead, are the so-called beastmen, who we technically can encounter early on in Limgrave as bosses, but who many players are likely to first encounter here, in their home in the sky. We have made a striking discovery, that the civilization of beastmen is made after a real Copper Age society that made a marvelous technological breakthrough that fascinates to this day. The thesis of this video, based on the archaeological evidence, is that the beastmen of Farum Azula are the first society in the world of Elden Ring to harness the power of gold. And the implications of this realization will help us achieve a new understanding of the lands between in the time before the age of the Erdtree. We know from the bestial vitality item description, which reads, quote, "Having gained intelligence, the beasts must have felt how their wildness slipped away as civilization took hold," end quote. That the beastmen were first granted intelligence by some higher power, resulting in the formation of society and a loss of their inherent wildness. In real-world prehistory, that is to say, before the written word, the transition from hunter-gatherer groups to more sophisticated societal arrangements, even before the advent of farming, is heralded by more complex burial rituals. As human societies became more complex, they started burying their dead, often associated with ritual sacrifices or burial with sacred objects. There's some evidence that our cousins, the Neanderthals, even started to do this as well before their eventual extinction. Just so, though the current beastmen of Farum Azula seem to have reverted back to a state of wildness, often seen hunched over on all fours scavenging remains, cannibalizing their own history, the unmistakable hallmarks of complex society they built after having initially been granted intelligence linger in the ruins of Farum Azula. All throughout the area, we see fossilized skeletons embedded into rock and walls, as well as a variety of dedicated burial chambers involving both burial and display, often on ritual altars or pedestals, and importantly, of individual beastmen. Several skeletons are shown bound to adjacent pillars in a manner clearly evocative of the Stone Age society in Demon Souls' Shrine of Storms, and their cult of hero burial and resurrection. And, with the possible exception of those entombed in the architecture itself, all the beastmen buried in Farum Azula have ornate gold jewelry, a very specific and informative design choice, because, as it turns out, we've discovered that these burials actually exist. The real-world inspiration for the Farum Azula burials is the Varna Necropolis. Initially discovered accidentally in the 1970s in modern-day Bulgaria, this site proved to be one of the most stunning in all of archaeology. The excavators found a series of graves dating to the mid-5th millennium BC, in which each of the bodies was buried with a remarkable array of gold jewelry. Some of the tombs had no body at all, only a symbolic grave, but still contained gold trinkets. But not until they came across burial number 43 did the team realize the full magnificence of their find. This burial held a man, evidently of much power and prestige, buried among such an astonishing amount of gold that, literally, There was more gold jewelry in this one burial site than in all other prehistoric sites combined. The man was buried with gold bracelets, necklaces, other trinkets, even a gold condom. 3,000 gold artifacts were found, amounting to 6 kilograms of gold, an absolutely astonishing amount for any era, let alone 6,000 years ago. If we compare the graves of Farum Azula to Varna Necropolis, we can plainly see the inspiration. The skeletons are arranged with similar placements, and importantly, framed in individual graves. The golden jewels bear striking similarities, from the golden bracelets right down to the circular trinkets, which are actually identical. And buried within the Varna graves there are copper tools as well, recognizable by their characteristic green rust, identifying this society as from the Copper Age or Chalcolithic era. In the real world, these societies were the transition states between the Neolithic and Bronze Ages, after farming had developed, but before the widespread use of bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. Likewise, we can see in the Dragon Temple of Farum Azula the unmistakable evidence of copper usage, consistent with a Chalcolithic society. Interestingly, in real-world prehistory, before the advent of more sophisticated metallurgy, societies and peoples predominantly relied on the most easily accessible metals for the production of jewelry, and importantly, they did not produce alloys by heating and mixing different metals together. In other words, all the gold in Varna is unalloyed. A common theory to explain the prevalence of gold in the Earth's crust is that the majority of gold derives from a massive meteorite shower around 3.9 billion years ago. NASA is even sending a probe to investigate 16 Psyche, an asteroid thought to contain massive amounts of metal, including gold. Perhaps these are the inspiration for the Elden Beast, who is said to have been brought to the lands between on a golden star. Just as the Copper Age cultures on Earth first learned to use the gold from predominantly meteorite sources, so the beastmen of Farum Azula learned the power of gold sent from the heavens. So, Farum Azula is actually in modern-day Bulgaria. Well, not exactly, of course. But the developer's decision to use this style of burial, so clearly evocative of the Varna burial site in particular, does carry certain fascinating implications. When the Varna discoveries were first reported, they caused something of a sensation. It was shown in exhibition across many countries in Europe and North America, as well as, in 1982, a 7-month stint in Japan with the title, "The Oldest Gold in the World," and accompanied by a large publicity tour. It is no stretch to think that this would have made quite an impression on then 8-year-old Hidetaka Miyazaki. So what does it mean that the developers used Varna as a template? Well, for one, it evokes the image of the oldest gold in the world, clearly meant to convey not just that Farum Azula is old in general, but that this society was the first, the oldest, to recognize the power of gold in the lands between. Gold not only adorns the buried figures, but also the tapestries, even the dragons themselves. Many of the remaining beastmen who roam the crumbling ruins wear similar gold jewelry as in the burial chambers. And in this fictional world, gold means but one thing: the influence of the Greater Will and its emissary, the Elden Beast. Of course, we already knew there was some influence of the Greater Will, as in the heart of the temple there exists an earlier version of the Elden Ring, not to mention the Dragon Lord Remembrance, which states, quote, "The Dragon Lord whose seat lies at the heart of the storm beyond time is said to have been Elden Lord in the age before the Erdtree. Once his god was fled, the Lord continued to await its return," end quote. If there is both an Elden Ring and an Elden Lord in the age of Farum Azula, the influence of the Greater Will is clear. So it appears what happened here was that the beasts were granted intelligence by the Greater Will, and its emissary, the Elden Beast. which explains their obsession with gold. And they developed a society using this newly gained intelligence. They began to use stone tools, as stated by the bestial sling incantation. Quote, "It is said that in the time before the Erdtree, stones were the first weapons of beasts who had gained intelligence." End quote. The use of tools was a symbol of their intelligence, in other words, their transformation from wild beasts into something more akin to humans. The Cinquedea makes this clear. Quote, "The design celebrates a beast's 5 fingers, symbolic of the intelligence once granted upon their time." End quote. In other words, the symbol of intelligence is the use of all 5 fingers, necessary for the making and using of tools, whereas the claw mark, representing their bestial wrath, contains only 3 marks instead of the full 5. And above all else, they began to bury their dead with gold ornamentation. These are the hallmarks of a nascent civilization, of culture in its essence, the use of tools and the development of burial rituals. We also see from the various statues depicting dragons in monumental prestige, flanked by beastmen attendants, that a hierarchy developed in Farum Azula, apparently with the beastmen serving their dragon lords. The Farum Azula beastmen ashes support this notion, as they state, quote, "These ruins are said to be the remains of a giant mausoleum enshrining an ancient dragon, guarded by chosen beastmen who wield weapons clad in lightning," end quote, indicating that the primary function of Farum Azula was worship of the dragons, and that the beastmen were granted intelligence in order to guard and serve their dragon overlords. But even within the beastmen themselves, there's a suggestion of hierarchy, as attested to by the ornate gold jewelry that surely not all beastmen could afford. Just like in Grave 43 of Varna, the development of such clear emblems of social rank and hierarchy is yet another hallmark of nascent civilization. In Farum Azula, we see the beginning of civilization and its entire arc compressed into a single location. The granting of intelligence and the shedding of bestial traits, the first use of tools, and the development of burial practices. More importantly, the Varna burials in Farum Azula show us that this is the original use of unalloyed gold. But then, in Farum Azula, all was eventually lost. As the Ruins Greatsword tells us, the city was destroyed by a meteorite, now doomed to slowly crumble in perpetuity. At some point, the beastmen began to revert back to their wild state, eventually having lost the blessing of intelligence once the city was impacted and the dragon Elden Lord's god was fled. But nor are they granted the closure that most great civilizations receive after their fall. For in the vortex of time that is Farum Azula, they roam forever in the remains of their once great city, ignorant of the fact that it is they who built it. And yet, the power of an idea can never be fully extinguished, and many eons later, the potency of unalloyed gold was rediscovered by a certain Empyrean in his attempt to combat the outer gods. But that is a story for another day.